I'm Richard Taylor from the Philosophy Department at Marquette University, and together with my colleague Andrea Robilio at the Catholic University of Leuven, where I'm also a visiting professor, interestingly enough, we present to you this course on Aquinas on Metaphysics. This class meeting is on Aristotle and pre-Avicennian metaphysics, and there are 3 lectures. This is the third of the 3. This is 6C, and its focus is on Aristotle's metaphysics and Al-Farabi's on the perfect state. So it's Al-Farabi's metaphysical discussions and on the perfect state. In videos 6A and 6B, I presented descriptive remarks on selected metaphysical teachings in the Plotiniana Arabica and the Kalam fi Macht al-Khair, that is, Discourse on the Pure Good, or Liber de Causis, as it was known in the Latin translation. Of course, the origin of these texts and teachings is the group famously denominated by Gerhard Endres as the Circle of Al-Kindi. In this presentation, I reach back to Aristotle's metaphysics to spell out some key doctrines of Aristotle that are relevant to our considerations, and ahead to Al-Farabi's on the perfect state to show how key notions in Aristotle are taken into the Neo-Aristotelianism of Al-Farabi, whose work is foundational, in fact, for the thought of Avicenna and Averroes in many and diverse ways. First of all, Metaphysics 1.1, the famous line, pardon me, all human beings by nature desire to know. Pantas anthropoi tuodene arrogantai fuse. The goal in this text is to explain the nature of knowing in its highest form, the metaphysical knowledge of highest causes and principles. This is wisdom, or Sophia, as theoretical knowledge. Aristotle writes, wisdom is knowledge about certain causes and principles. And of course, those causes and principles will be the highest causes and principles. He writes, since we are seeking this knowledge, and we must inquire of what are the causes and the principles, we must inquire of what kind are the causes and principles, the knowledge of which is wisdom, Sophia. We suppose first then, he continues, that the wise man knows all things as far as possible, although he does not have knowledge of each of them individually. Secondly, that he who can learn things that are difficult and not easy for human beings to know is wise. Sense perception is common to all, and therefore easy, and no mark of wisdom, writes Aristotle. He goes on, again, he who is more exact and more capable of teaching the causes is wiser in every branch of knowledge. And of the sciences also, that which is desirable on its own account and for the sake of knowing it is more of the nature of wisdom than that which is desirable on account of its results. And the superior science is more of the nature of wisdom than the ancillary. For the wise man must not be ordered, but must order. And he must not obey another, but the less wise must obey him. So Aristotle's very clear here in setting aside the notion of practical science as possibly being wisdom. Practical action, wisdom in the sense of knowing what's ethically right. He's not interested in that. He's interested in the highest form of wisdom. That highest form of wisdom will be metaphysics. Let's carry on with Aristotle then. He continues, such and so many are the notions then which we have about wisdom and the wise. These are common notions then. Now of these characteristics, that of knowing all things must belong to him who has, in the highest degree, universal knowledge. For he knows, in a sense, all the subordinate objects. So, if you know the universals, you certainly know all the particulars and how they fit under the universal. Just as a physician must know the universal in order to treat many different patients. And these things, he continues, and these things, the most universal, are, on the whole, the hardest for men to know, for they are the furthest from the senses. Sense perception is easy, but knowledge is more difficult. He continues, and the most exact of the sciences are those which deal most with first principles. For those which involve fewer principles are more exact than those which involve additional principles. For example, arithmetic than geometry. Now, he continues, but the science which investigates causes is also more capable of reaching, for the people who teach are those who tell the causes of each thing. And understanding and knowledge pursued for their own sake are found most in the knowledge of that which is most knowable. For he who chooses to know for the sake of knowing, for he who chooses to know for the sake of knowing will choose most readily that which is most truly knowledge. And such is the knowledge of that which is most knowable. And the first principles and the causes are most knowable. For by reason of these and from these all other things are known. But these are not known by means of things subordinate to them. So our knowledge is going to start off at the highest level here. When we have knowledge of universals, then we understand how the particulars should be understood and functioning. He continues then, and the science which knows to what end, notice the final cause here, to what end each thing must be done, is the most authoritative of the sciences, and more authoritative than any ancillary science. And this end is the good in each class, and in general the supreme good in the whole of nature. Judged by all the tests we have mentioned, then, the name in question falls to the same science. This must be a science that investigates the first principles and causes, for the good, that is, that for the sake of which, is one of the causes. So all this is a description of metaphysics according to Aristotle. And you should be aware that Aristotle himself did not use the term metaphysics. But it's understood to have come from the notion of ta meta ta physica, the things that come after the physical things. But Aristotle does not use the term metaphysics himself. As we'll see shortly, he uses the term first philosophy, and he also speaks of theology, but we're not there yet. Here in Metaphysics Book 1, though, he's explaining what the person of wisdom and the highest kind of wisdom should be pursuing and what that person understands. And of course, it is the highest causes and principles of things. So Aristotle goes on after this in these chapters to say that philosophy begins either in wonder, as Plato had said, or in the desire to escape ignorance. And he goes on to note that the knowledge desired is not sought for any other reason than for the sake of knowing itself. So you see how he connects it up with that first statement about all human beings by nature desire to have knowledge or to know. He then writes, evidently then, we do not seek it for the sake of any other advantage, but as the human being is free, we say, who exists for himself and not for another, so we pursue this as the only free science, for it alone exists for itself, that is, for its own sake. We pursue metaphysics then, not in order to do things, but rather to understand things and to know. So this science is not excluded from us, even if it is the most divine science, he notes, quote, for the science which it would be most meet or appropriate for God to have is a divine science, and so is any science that deals with divine objects. And of course, by divine objects, he means things that are eternal. And this science alone has both these qualities. For God is thought to be among the causes of all things and to be a first principle. And such a science either God alone can have or God above all others. All the sciences, indeed, are more necessary than this, but none is better. Let's quote. So God is an object, can be an object here that the science deals with, and God has the kind of knowledge that the person who deals with this science would have as well. So, regarding Metaphysics 1, in these passages then, Aristotle states that the wisdom that humans ultimately seek by natural desire is a science of causes and principles, reaching up to God and other divine objects. These, of course, are then the eternal causes and principles of all things, and certainly we see eternal causes and principles in the sky when we observe the sun in the day and the moon and stars at night. That's what Aristotle has in mind. But he also would be interested in pursuing these things and what might be behind these eternal things that we see in the sky. So the question is this: does this mean that highest wisdom and the science of first philosophy is in fact cosmology and natural science. As we'll see, that's not the case. Metaphysics Alpha-Elaton, or Book 2, discusses causes and principles and the difficulty of obtaining precise and correct knowledge of highest causes and principles. But it also asserts the notion that such causes must exist and be sought out by human beings. Book 2, Chapter 1, he writes, "Perhaps as difficulties are of two kinds, the cause of the present difficulty is not in the facts but in us. For as the eyes of bats are to the blaze of day, so is the reason in our soul to the things which are by nature most evident of all." Now, what he has in mind here is that the things that are most evident of all, or the most intelligible, are things such as eternal causes and principles, or God. They have the greatest amount of intelligibility. But our powers of reason are very weak, and when we try to look upon these things which are so intelligible, we find that we don't have the capability for it. Now, two brief remarks here on this interpretations of this passage by Averroes and Aquinas. First of all, Averroes views this as the notion that we can come to know first causes, but it'll be very, very difficult. Aquinas, however, thinks of this in terms of knowing God as the first cause of all things. And Aquinas wants to assert, and does clearly assert, that in this passage, Aristotle is indicating the impossibility of our coming to know fully, have comprehensive knowledge of the first causes and principles of all things, namely God. This was an important matter then, secondly, for the Averroes controversy, because on the one hand, Averroes is saying that we can come to have full human happiness in knowing the highest causes of all through the highest power that we have, namely intellect. There is some way then for Averroes in this life that we can have human happiness. Aquinas, however, wants to say, and does say quite clearly, that the only way that we can have full human happiness, in religious terms, ultimate human beatitude, is through seeing the very face of God, or the essence of God in itself, something that can only happen supernaturally in the next world. So on the one hand, we have Aquinas saying that religion, grace, and divine help are required in order to have the highest kind of knowledge. And on the other hand, we have Averroes saying that this is possible for human beings with ordinary human powers of knowing. So this caused quite a controversy, because if Averroes is correct, the question arises as to what the function of religion is, what the function of revelation is, what the function of grace is, and many other difficulties arise. And certainly in the Latin context, this arose and was a great controversy at the University of Paris. I'd be delighted to talk about that further with you another time, but for now, I just mentioned it in passing. So again, Alpha-Elaton, Book 2, Chapter 1, Aristotle writes, quote, "Now we do not know a truth without its cause, and a thing has a quality in a higher degree than other things if, in virtue of it, the similar quality belongs to other things. For example, fire is the hottest of things, for it is the cause of the heat of all other things. So that which causes derivative truths to be true is most true." And then he adds, "Therefore the principles of eternal things must always be most true, for they are not merely sometimes true, nor is there any cause of their being, but they themselves are the cause of the being of other things, so that as each thing is in respect of being, so is it in respect of truth." Close quote. Now notice what's happening here. Aquinas is asserting that in any hierarchy with regard to truth or being, the highest thing in there is the cause of the rest of the things below it. This is precisely what both Aquinas and Averroes hold for very different reasons. So that the first thing to be at the top of this hierarchy then is God, or the ultimate principles. For Aristotle, the gods, or the divine. For Aquinas, It's the one unique God. For Varros, it is also the one unique God, but the way they argue to it is quite different. And we'll see that later when we talk about Averroes in this class. Now, I turn now to Metaphysics Book 4, and here is where Aristotle lays out the notion of metaphysics as the science of being qua being. What we've already seen that is it's a science of causes, reaching up to a highest cause in some way. It's a science of causes and principles and having knowledge at the highest level of the universal and what is universal through what it causes. And so now he wants to investigate the question of being as being. He writes there the following, quote, "There is a science which investigates being qua being, or being as being, and the attributes which belong to this in virtue of its own nature. Now, this is not the same as any of the so-called special sciences, for none of these others deals generally with being as being. They cut off a part of being and investigate the attributes of this part. This is what the mathematical sciences do, for instance. Now, since we are seeking the first principles and highest causes, clearly there must be something to which these belong in virtue of its own nature. If then our predecessors who sought the elements of existing things were seeking these same principles, it's necessary that the elements must be elements of being, not by accident, but just because it is being. Therefore, it is of being as being that we must grasp the first causes." So he's proposing then a study of being and the nature of being and the causes of being here. Much the same as what we saw earlier, but he's going to take it in a different direction. He writes, obviously then, after discussing various attributes of beings, he writes, obviously then it is the work of one science to examine being qua being and the attributes which belong to it qua being. And the same science will examine not only substances, but also their attributes, both those above named and what is prior and posterior, genus and species, whole and part, and the others of this sort. Close quote. So on this account, the science of metaphysics will be the science of being qua being, in the sense that it will be an investigation of substances and their attributes, because the primary instance of being is substance. And the attributes of substance, or the accidents, or other considerations of substance, are posterior to substance itself. So this will be, as it were, an ontology. Aristotle's Metaphysics, Book 6, takes a different approach, but it seems to have much of the same reasoning, but it takes a different approach. He writes in Book 6, Chapter 1, "We are seeking the principles and causes of the things that are, and obviously of things qua being." That's very familiar. "For there is a cause of health and of good condition, and the objects of mathematics have principles and elements and causes. In general, every science which is rationative or at all involves reasoning deals with causes and principles, exact or indeterminate. But all these sciences mark off some particular being, some genus, and inquire into this, but not into being simply, or qua being. Nor do they offer any discussion of the essence of the things of which they treat. But starting from the essence, some making it plain to the senses, others assuming it as a hypothesis, they then demonstrate more or less cogently the essential attributes of the genus with which they deal. It is obvious, therefore, from such a review of the sciences, that there is no demonstration of substance or of the essence, but some other way of revealing it." Now that's important, take note of that. There is no demonstration of substance or of the essence, but some other way of revealing that. And so we have to see something to be a substance and find it another way. It's not through demonstration. He goes on and makes this further comment that I want to make a remark about. Quote, "And similarly, the sciences omit the question whether the genus with which they deal exists or does not exist, because it belongs to the same line of thought to show what it is and that it is." Joseph Owens, in his article on Aristotle and Aquinas, one article I've recommended before in the Oxford Handbook of Aquinas, cites this passage as well and says that Aristotle thought that the very same considerations were relevant to showing what something is and that it is, while in fact Aquinas thinks that these are distinct issues and do not belong to the same line of thought. But let's resume with Aristotle. He goes on in Book 6, but if there is something which is eternal and immovable and separable, clearly the knowledge of it belongs to a theoretical science, not however to natural science, for natural science deals with certain movable things, nor to mathematics, but to a science that is prior to both. For natural science deals with things which are inseparable from matter, but not immovable, and some parts of mathematics deal with things which are immovable, but probably not separable, but embodied in matter. While the first science deals with things that are both separable and immovable. All right, so now that first science, and the other science is going to be the theoretical science of first philosophy or metaphysics. And it deals with things that are separable and immovable. He goes on then, now all causes must be eternal, but especially these, for they are the causes of so much of the divine as appears to us. There must then be three theoretical philosophies, mathematics, natural science, and theology, since it is obvious that if the divine is present anywhere, it is present in things of this sort. The highest science must deal with the highest genus, so that the theoretical sciences are superior to the other sciences, and this to the other theoretical sciences. That is, mathematics, that metaphysics will be superior to the other sciences. He goes on, one might indeed raise the question whether first philosophy is universal, or deals with one genus, that is, one kind of being. For not even the mathematical sciences are all alike in this respect. Geometry and astronomy deal with certain particular kind of thing, while universal mathematics applies alike to both. And he continues, we answer that if there is no substance other than those which are formed by nature, natural science will be first science. But if there is an immovable substance, the science of this must be prior and must be first philosophy, and universal in this way because it is first. And it will belong to this, to consider being qua being, both what it is and the attributes which belong to it qua being. So on this account of metaphysics as theology, the primary concern is to deal with the immovable substance or the immaterial substance. And also then, in virtue of that, it will also deal with what it causes, and that is being qua being, what something is, and the attributes that belong to it qua being. But the concern here will be that if we can show that there is something beyond the physical, then metaphysics must be a science that covers all of the immaterial, non-physical entities, and also the rest of all being as being, some of it being physical, some of it being immaterial. So in this case, then, Aristotle is asserting that metaphysics is primarily theology. Now, Aristotle himself did not make a good connection between or proper blending together of the discussion of being qua being and theology as such, and there's a great deal of controversy about this in the literature. But I raise it here because, as we will see, Al-Kindi and in the Platiniana Arabica and Liber de Causas, in that circle of Al-Kindi, it's held that metaphysics is in fact theology. Whereas we'll see Al-Farabi holds that metaphysics is in fact about the science of being qua being, and God, or theology, is treated within the science of being qua being. Now we jump then to the famous Book 12, Chapter 6 of Aristotle's Metaphysics. It's important to see his argument here, so we're going to spend a bit of time on this, but we need to see the key parts of his argument that are quite relevant. Then, through these 5 different passages or sections of Aristotle's Metaphysics, you'll have a good background for seeing what takes place in the Arabic tradition and later in Aquinas. So here, this is the beginning of Metaphysics Book 12, or Lambda, Chapter 6. Since there were three kinds of substance, two of them natural and one unmovable, the two natural substances are the are the transitory substances of the physical world and the eternal substances in the heavens. So, two of them natural and one unmovable. Regarding the latter, we must assert that it is necessary that there should be an eternal unmovable substance. This will be God for Aristotle, or the gods. For substances are the first of existing things, and if they are all destructible, all things are destructible. But it is impossible that movement should either come into being or cease to be, for it must always have existed. So Aristotle believes, as was set forward in his Physics, that movement is eternal. Now, understanding that movement is eternal, the question is, what is needed to assure this eternality? He goes on, nor can time come into being or cease to be, for there could not be a before and an after if time did not exist. So he's drawing arguments here from his Physics. Movement is also continuous then in the sense in which time is, for time is either the same thing as movement or an attribute of movement. And there is no continuous movement except movement in place, and of this only that which is circular is continuous. So what he's talking about here is the continuous motion of bodies in the heavens. But if there is something which is capable of moving things or acting on them, but is not actually doing so, there will be no movement, for that which has a capacity need not exercise it. Therefore, if there's a cause of motion of these things, then of course Aristotle is saying that it has to be an actuality. He goes on, nothing then is gained, even if we suppose eternal substances as the believers in the forms do, unless there is to be in them some principle which can cause movement, that is, cause the eternal movement. And even this is not enough, nor is another substance besides the forms enough, for if it does not act, there will be no movement. So it has to be something that acts. And do Plato's forms act as such? No, we're trying to explain eternal motion here. That's what's key in the discussion. And so we need something that must be acting. He goes on further, and even if it acts, this will not be enough if its substance is potentiality. For there will not be eternal movement. For that which is potentially may possibly not be. Notice that may possibly not be. That's what he must forestall. That cannot be the case. There must then be such a principle whose very substance is actuality. Further then, these substances must be without matter, for they must be eternal, at least if anything else is eternal. Therefore, they must be actuality. Close quote. Now notice what's coming then. These are immaterial substances. They are eternal actualities without matter. These then will also be intellects, according to Aristotle. We'll be carrying on now. So Aristotle then, just a few remarks here then. It's key for Aristotle that this be actual, not a potentiality. And he also states that actuality is prior. Now then in Metaphysics 12:7, he says that the heavens, the eternal heavens, move themselves with desire. Desire for what? Quote, and the object of desire and the object of thought move in this way. They move without being moved. So Aristotle is moving toward his doctrine here of an unmoved mover, something that moves others without itself being moved. 12:7, he continues, the first mover then of necessity exists, this is his proof, and insofar as it is necessary, it is good, and in this sense a first principle. For the necessary has all these senses, that which is necessary perforce because it is contrary to impulse, that without which the good is impossible, and that which cannot be otherwise, but is absolutely necessary. So he continues in his argument then, on such a principle then depend the heavens and the world of nature. So this is an immaterial principle that is actuality. And its life is such as the best which we can enjoy, and enjoy but for a short time. He also says something similar in Nicomachean Ethics 10:7. For it is ever in this state which we cannot be, since its actuality is also pleasure, and therefore waking perception and thinking are most pleasant, and hopes and memories are so because of their reference to these. And thought in itself deals with that which is best in itself, and that which is thought in the fullest sense with that which is best in the fullest sense. Okay, so he's just getting ready to say that God has it himself as the best object, and God is thought thinking thought. He continues. And thought thinks itself because it shares the nature of the object of thought, for it becomes an object of thought in coming into contact with and thinking its objects, so that thought and an object of thought are the same. For that which is capable of receiving the object of thought, that is the substance, is thought, and it is active when it possesses this object. Therefore, the latter rather than the former is the divine element, which thought seems to contain. And the act of contemplation is what is most pleasant and best. If then, he continues, God is always in that good state which we sometimes are, this compels our wonder. And if in a better state, this compels it yet more. And God is in a better state. So he's given you all those characteristics there as well of God already that he's established. And now he says, and life also belongs to God. Why? For the actuality of thought is life, and God is that actuality, and God's essential actuality is life, most good and eternal. We say therefore that God is a living being, eternal, most good, so that life and duration, continuous and eternal, belong to God. For this is God. So this is the essential argument that he has for God, but he's going to bring out other characteristics as well. But you can see those for yourself in Book 12 of Aristotle's Metaphysics, including the discussion of the unity. Now these then are the 5 key texts which were so important in the formation of the understanding of Aristotle's metaphysics on the part of thinkers of the Arabic tradition. Is first philosophy, again the term metaphysics is not Aristotle's, is first philosophy the study of being qua being and its concomitants? Let's call it ontology. Or is first philosophy or metaphysics theology, the study of the highest causes and principles of all, God or the gods? Again, the view of the Circle of Al-Kindi was that metaphysics is about theology. The view of Al-Farabi and Avicenna, following Al-Farabi, is that in fact it's about ontology. The view of Averroes is that metaphysics is primarily about the first substance of all, and then all the things that are caused by it. So for Averroes, it's also theology. What is the view of Aquinas? Well, we'll get to that later. Now I want to look at Al-Farabi's Neo-Aristotelianism here. Al-Farabi was, in our readings on the perfect state, Al-Farabi was a member of the Neo-Aristotelian school of Baghdad. He studied with Christians Yohuna ibn Haylan and Abu Bakr Mata, and he taught Christian philosopher and theologian Yahya ibn Adi. Al-Farabi crafted an emanationist cosmology and a metaphysics that was much revised by Avicenna, after which it became widely accepted. But he played a key role for Avicenna. And his account of Al-Farabi's account of metaphysics as a study of being qua being and its attributes, or ontology, as I said we would call it, was meant to be a corrective to the Circle of Al-Kindi, which held for the view that metaphysics is theology. The work, The Aims of Aristotle's Metaphysics, by Al-Farabi, was mentioned by Avicenna as very important. Avicenna said he read Aristotle's Metaphysics 40 times and didn't understand what it was about until he read The Aims of Aristotle's Metaphysics by Al-Farabi, a treatise that Avicenna happened to come into possession of by chance, he says, at a bazaar with the booksellers. But more of that later. Now let's look at the text here of Al-Farabi, because it's a really quite valuable text, and it does give us a good look into the fundamental approach to metaphysics that's going to be very common in the Arabic tradition. Chapter 1, Section 1. The first cause is the first existent is the first cause of the existence of all the other existence. It is free of every kind of deficiency, whereas there must be in everything else some kind of deficiency, either one or more than one. But the first is free of all their deficiencies. Thus, its existence is the most excellent and precedes every other existence. No existence can be more excellent than or prior to its existence. Thus, it has the highest kind of excellent existence and the most elevated rank of perfect existence. Therefore, its existence and substance cannot be adulterated by non-existence at all. This is very, very descriptive of Aristotle's conception of God. So keep Aristotle in mind, the Aristotle we just looked at in mind as we read through Farabi here together. Farabi goes on then, it can in no way have existence potentially, and there is no possibility whatsoever that it should not exist. We've already read this in Aristotle. He goes on, therefore it is without beginning and everlasting in its substance and essence, without being in need of any other thing, which would provide its permanence in order to be eternal. Its substance suffices for its permanence and its everlasting existence. So far, just like Aristotle here. No existence at all can be like its existence, nor is there any existence of the rank of its existence which the first would have and which it does not have already. Now Farabi is getting into something quite different from Aristotle. Remember, Aristotle had a hierarchy with 47 or 53 gods or unmoved movers in the heavens, and he never provided a per se ranking of those unmoved movers or pure actualities. Here, though, Al-Farabi is asserting that there is a rank, and at the top there is only one. And that one is the highest of rank and everything else below it. He continues, it is the existent for whose existence there can be no cause, through which or out of which or for the sake of which it has come to exist. So it's self-existent. For it is neither matter, nor is it at all sustained by matter or a substratum. His existence is free of all matter and substratum. We have this in Aristotle. Nor does it have form, because form can exist only in matter. Now, notice, in Aristotle's account, we might call those actualities pure forms. Here, though, Al-Farabi wants to restrict the use of the term form to something that can exist only in matter. So, nor does it have form, because form can exist only in matter. If it had form, its essence would be composed of matter and form, and if it were like that, it would be sustained by the two parts of which it would be composed, and its existence would have a cause, because it would be a cause of the two parts coming together, is what he has in mind. Likewise, its existence has no purpose or aim, of course, none outside itself, as Aristotle had said. No purpose and no aim, so that it would exist merely to fulfill that aim or that purpose. Otherwise, that would have been a cause of its existence, and so it would not be the first cause. So it's not compatible with it being first cause. Likewise, it is not derived its existence from something else prior to it, and even less so from something inferior to it. He goes on then. In section 2, he says the first existent is different in its substance from everything else, and it's impossible for anything else to have the existence it has. And then he gives arguments for that. And those arguments are elaborated further by Avicenna. Section 3, the first cannot have a contrary. Section 4, again, the first is not divisible in thought into things which would constitute its substance. So we can't even divide it into parts by our thinking with a conceptual distinction. Section 5, if then the first is indivisible with regard to its substance, the existence it has, by which it is distinguished from all other existence, cannot be any other than that by which it exists in itself. So it's self-constituted here. Therefore, its distinction from all others is due to a oneness which is its essence. So that oneness, which is its essence, distinguishes it from all other things. For one of the meanings of oneness is the particular existence by which each existent is distinguished from all others. The strength of this meaning of oneness, by the strength of this meaning of oneness, each existent is called one, inasmuch as it has its own particular existence. This meaning of the term one goes necessarily with existence. The two work together. And these are common notions, but they work together. Thus, the first is one in this respect as well, and deserves more than any other one the name and meaning of the one. You can obviously see there's a Neoplatonic background here operating. Section 6, he explains that the first is without matter, it's intelligible through its substance, and its essence is thinking. That's Aristotle. Section 7, it knows, it is knowing and it is known through itself, so it's both knower and known. Section 8, it's wise, since wisdom is thinking the most excellent thing in the most excellent way of knowing. Section 9, it is real and true, since these go along with existence, al-wujud. Section 10, it is alive and living. Section 11, it exists of its own outside minds in utmost perfection. And I have a passage here on this. Quote, the most perfect and most powerful, the more perfect and more powerful a visible thing is, the weaker is our visual apprehension of it, and not because of its being hidden or deficient, It has, on the contrary, in itself the utmost brightness and luminosity, but because the perfection of its splendor dazzles our sight so that our eyes are bewildered. Of course, this comes from Book 2 of Aristotle's Metaphysics, Alpha Elaton, and the reference to the bats and the light of the day. Thus, he explains it further, though. Thus, our minds in relation to the first cause, the first intellect, and the first living thing are in this way. Our thinking it is deficient, not because of any deficiency. Our thinking it is deficient, not because of any deficiency in the first, and our apprehension of it is difficult for us, not because of its substance being difficult to apprehend, but rather because our minds are too weak to represent it to ourselves. That's why the intelligibles within our minds are deficient. And that's the explanation of Aristotle's Alpha Elaton, or Book 2 of the Metaphysics, as according to Al-Farabi here in the perfect state. Section 12, he speaks of it as utmost in greatness, majesty, and glory. 13, beauty and brilliance and splendor. 14, pleasure, delight, and enjoyment. And 15, it is most loving, of course, most loving of itself in this regard. What are these? Well, these are divine attributes, are they not? All right, he goes on then. He then goes on and writes the following then, with the first cause as the, this is chapter 2, not chapter 1. Pardon me. Section 1. The first is that from which everything else comes into existence. The genesis of that which comes into existence takes place by way of emanation. So this is the Neoplatonic notion of emanation being used by Al-Farabi here. The existence of which is due to the existence of something else, so that the existence of something different from the first emanates from the first's existence. It is not pantheism. It does not emanate something of itself, but something different from the first. It's important to note. But the first does not exist for the sake of anything else, and not in order that anything else should be brought into existence by it, so that the purpose of its existence would be to bring about the existence of all other things in such a way that its existence would have a cause apart from itself, and it would thus not be the first. Okay, so the first part of this quotation is about efficient causality. Now it's a question about final causality. Does it exist for the sake of something else? And then he says, again, by giving existence to something else, the first does not attain a perfection which it did not have before, apart from the perfection which it has. That is, by giving to others, it does not become more perfect in some way. So in that sense, the goodness of God, or the first, does not increase by its emanation, because it's already the most perfect goodness. Section 2 of chapter 2. The existents are many in number, and in addition to their being numerous, they vary in excellence. The substance of the first is a substance from which every existent emanates, however it may be, whether perfect or deficient. But the substance of the first is also such that all the existents, when they emanate from it, are arranged in an order of rank, and that every existent gets its allotted share and rank of existence from it. It starts with the most perfect existent and is followed by something a little less perfect than it. So we have a emanative hierarchy at work here. Section 3, its substance ranks, orders. Its substance ranks, orders, connects, and arranges what it emanates. This is called provenance. Section 4, he says, and this is really quite important on naming, so I quote this at length. Quote, the names by which the first is to be called are those which denote perfection and excellence of existence in what we hold to be the most excellent existence. None of these names, however, denotes, in the case of the first itself, the perfection which is customarily denoted by them when applied to existence in our world. Notice that then, if the names are coming from our world, they don't mean the same when they're said of the first, even to the most excellent of them, but they denote the perfection which is exclusive to the substance of the first. So the names that we use denote an excellence that belongs to the first, but the conceptual content is not the same because of the finitude of excellences in our world, in our experience. So we attribute the perfection, but we don't know the whole conceptual content of that perfection in the excellence of the first cause. Those of you who know Aquinas, this should sound somewhat familiar, although Aquinas never read this work. Section 5 continues then. Some of the names which denote perfection, section 5 then, some of the names which denote perfection and excellence of things in our world denote an essential property of the thing in question, and are not predicated of it as being related to something else, such as the existent, the one, the living. Other names, others, however, denote a property of the thing in question inasmuch as it is related to something else apart from it, such as the just, the generous. We continue. When these names are applied to our world, they denote an excellence and a perfection whose relation to another thing apart from it constitutes a part of that perfection. Hence, that relation is a part of the whole which the name denotes, or that excellence and perfection is based on the relation to another thing. Now, when names like these are transferred and applied to the first, we have in mind to denote by them the relation the first has to other things by virtue of the existence which has been emanating from it. Okay, in virtue of its emanations, the names are transferred that way and applied to the first by virtue of what it causes. He continues, we ought, however, not to make the relation a part of the perfection of the first, because the perfection of the first is all contained within itself already. Nor ought we, he cautions, in addition, to understand the perfection denoted by that name as based on that relation, because the names and the perfections in the first are there irrespective of the rest of existence. He goes on, but we ought to denote it by a substance and a perfection whose necessary concomitant this relation is. And the fact that this relation is based on that substance and is a concomitant of that substance which is denoted by that name. So the name belongs to the first, and what it denotes belongs to the first alone. So these are characteristics of the first. Perhaps we don't apprehend these characteristics fully because of the difficulty of their transcendence and lucidity and the weakness of our minds. But the predications belong to the first, are made of the first, but can't be conceptually fleshed out fully by what we see in the world. I think that's really quite important. Well, this is already a very long lecture, so let me stop here with Al-Farabi, and we'll take up discussions of this at class on Thursday. Thanks very much.